Welcome to another edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. Andy Barch with AM 930 WEOL and 100.3 FM. As always, joined at a safe social distance by Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and of course, BrownsZone.com. Approaching the end of July, and while things will be different, we've got training camp to talk about, which is right around the corner. Scott, great to be joined by you as always, and hard to believe training camp is already here.
No kidding, Bull. It feels like forever since football, right? Because we didn't have any OTAs, we didn't have any mini camps. But it also feels like the end of July has gotten here pretty quickly. So a lot of moving pieces. We talk about training camp, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but we're not quite at training camp yet, right? We have the rookies, quarterbacks, injured players. They're reporting to Berea today. We're taping this on Friday, but all it is going to be a COVID-19 test, and then they're sent back home. They're not even allowed in the building until they have two negative tests 72 hours apart from each other. So I think it's a good sign that we can kind of see football on the horizon, but we're not there yet.
Not just yet, and as you mentioned, we will certainly come back around to that. It just doesn't feel totally comfortable, this relationship between the owners and the players. That's something that we will hit on. We'll get into an article that you wrote yesterday about Chris Hubbard as it relates to mental health, and we'll also talk about the timeline for camp with the NFL dropping preseason games and the new guidelines associated with that as well. But, Scott, I want to start with a new coach on the staff for the Browns. Veteran coach Kevin Rogers has joined the staff as a senior offensive assistant. Scott, what is it that he brings to the table, and how will he be able to help?
I think he has many benefits. Well, I'm going to say the biggest is his relationship with Coach Kevin Stefanski. And we know that Kevin Stefanski's a young coach. We know he's a first-time head coach. And really, he was only an offensive coordinator play caller for a season plus. And Rodgers has been coaching since 1974, most of it on the collegiate level, but some the NFL level. And he was a quarterback coach with the Vikings when Stefanski started with the Vikings. And Rodgers' last 2 years with the Vikings, which were 2009 and 10, Stefanski had moved up to assistant quarterbacks coach, and that began his progression to be the Browns head coach. So I just think having a guy like Kevin Rogers, who Kevin Stefanski is really familiar with, who he considers a mentor, is extremely valuable for a young head coach. Not to mention the unique circumstances of this offseason, of this season, of this training camp, no preseason, all those things. But just in normal circumstances, a new head coach has a lot to deal with, and everything is new. And if you have a trusted guy that you can turn to and go to and ask anything that's been around, has probably seen everything there is to see, I just think there's a comfort level there. So while Rodgers will benefit Baker Mayfield, because Rodgers coached Brett Favre at the end of his career with the Vikings, and we know the Baker Mayfield-Brett Favre comparisons, he'll be an asset there. And he will have an impact on all the offensive positions, right? He's not going to just focus on quarterbacks. He's going to be there for all the coaches, offensive coaches to talk to. He'll bounce around between meetings and at practice, between position groups. But I think the most valuable thing is that he's an ear for Kevin Stefanski. And, Stefanski brought in coaches he knows, right? Coaches he's worked with. But not everybody. Alex Van Pelt, the offensive coordinator, Stefanski doesn't have a previous working relationship with him. So I just think it helps to have a guy that you've kind of been through the wars with, right? Worked with before, and has a ton of experience for a staff that overall is relatively young.
Absolutely, and I think that familiarity, that comfortability is certainly going to be huge, especially in the early stages of camp. And, Scott, I think we're all anxiously awaiting that green light for camp, because at the end of our last conversation last week, I certainly feel like there was a lot of turmoil, but we thought they had kind of rectified all of that, because at the beginning of the week, it seemed like they worked everything out. and there were a lot of things that we thought they had certainly ironed out, and it seemed like we were streamlining towards a full-blown training camp with no preseason games. That was one of the big hang-ups, but now it seems like there are still some underlying issues here that have to be ironed out. What is it exactly that the players and the owners don't seem to be on the same page with still?
Yeah, it's weird, Bull, because it's kind of peaks and valleys. You know, if you're kind of taking the temperature on, how optimistic are you feeling at this time of this day? And I think overall, the league and the Players Association have made a lot of strides on return to work guidelines and safety guidelines. I feel much better about it than I did a week ago. And I also wonder how much is posturing, right? You know, you look at, we're focused on the virus and you're focused on, testing and preseason games, but it's a negotiation and it's a business. And obviously it's always somewhat contentious, and we saw baseball go through it during the pandemic, and it took forever to get back on the field. And you're seeing a little bit of that in the NFL, and some of it I think is posturing. We saw reports come out yesterday that, well, if the league and the Players Association can't agree on the financials, right? Because we're assuming there's going to be a huge revenue shortfall this season because of a lack of fans in the stands. Now, some teams might have limited fans, but if there are any fans at all, they will be severely limited. It really hurts the revenue of the owners in the league. So they have to balance that out in future salary caps, because the players get about 48% of the revenues, and that's tied directly to the salary cap. So if you just had the revenue shortfall from 2020 forwarded to 2021, it would decimate salary caps, and you'd see a flood of players cut, and it would stop. Guys like Baker Mayfield probably would not be able to sign long-term contracts because there's no money to pay him in that first year, on and on and on. So the players and the owners are trying to figure out how they're going to manage that shortfall. And the owners want it in a short period of time so they can start getting their money back. And the players want it spread out over a long, maybe a decade, to kind of ease this, to smooth out the salary cap, right? So there's not huge fluctuations. And the owners are trying not to be on the hook for a decade trying to make their money back. So I think my point is there's posturing. And is the NFL really going to, these are what the reports were yesterday, that the NFL could say, nope, stop reporting players. We're going to continue the offseason virtually until there's an agreement on this. That doesn't seem realistic to me. I think the NFL has gone this far that they're not going to tell players to stay in their hotel rooms instead of reporting to training camp. That just doesn't seem likely to me. I think it's more of a public threat, which of course does not sit well with the players. And one of the union chiefs, snapped back on Twitter about it. So, I don't like to see that, even though it's to be expected and it's natural in negotiations. It doesn't sit right during these times. You'd like to see both sides be able to work together and come to an agreement and not take these public stances. Having said that, the two biggest areas that need to be reconciled still, right? They took care of the preseason. There's no preseason games, which is what the players were saying, not only demanding, but saying all the medical experts. The union and the NFL had combined to have medical experts come up with guidelines, and that included this long acclimation period, which by its nature would wipe out the preseason. So finally, the NFL conceded there. And then the players said, hey, we need as much testing as possible to corral this situation. And so we feel safe to practice. So that the players asked for and were finally granted everyday testing, at least at the start of training camp. I think for at least the first 2 weeks, there'll be everyday testing. And then after that, if the percentage is below, I want to say 5%, then it can go every other day. So the league agreed to that. Now it becomes the money situation, like I mentioned. How are we going to deal with the revenue shortfall? And then the acclimation period. And the players still want a really gradual ramp up. And by this, I mean, let's say July 31st, the rookies and the veterans have all had their 2 negative tests, 72 hours apart. They can actually report to Berea as a unit July 31st. Well, the players want like 18 days of strength and conditioning, followed by 10 days of non-contact practice before you put the pads on for the last 2 weeks before the regular season. I think the NFL is fighting them on the length of that. Do we really need whatever it is, 14, 18 days of strength and conditioning? Can we put the pads on sooner? And the players' argument is this is an off-season like no other. Not only were there no OTAs or mini camps, many players were not able to train in the off-season like they normally do because gyms were closed, because you're forced to work out at your house because of the pandemic. And J.C. Tretter, the Browns center and the union president, keeps pointing to a study after the 2011 lockout, which players could still work out on their own. They just couldn't train as a team in the offseason. And hamstring injuries were way up, Achilles injuries were way up, and they're correlating that directly to the lack of a normal offseason, and this is even less normal. So they want as much time as possible to try to decrease the risk of those injuries. And I understand that, but I think the league is fighting back, saying, hey, we need to actually practice. And it can't just be 2 weeks of lifting weights and running. So that's a big issue, and then the money. Those two things seem like the biggest stumbling blocks to let's proceed with the training camp and try to take these real first steps toward the season.
And you mentioned it already, Scott. They did get past a few big hurdles. Dropping the preseason games, I think, was a really big one. And on the surface, it doesn't seem like that was really a tough pill for the owners to swallow because in many cases, most of these teams wouldn't be able to have fans in the seats anyways. So I'm not exactly sure how much money they would have lost out on that anyways. But they were able to drop the preseason games. Camp rosters cut to 80 players. How will all of this directly impact the Browns?
Well, I think the lack of the preseason, or lack of a preseason, hurts the Browns. And it's kind of like the discussions we've had throughout this whole virtual offseason bowl is new coach, new offensive system, new defensive system, a relatively young roster still. You just want as much, well, not only do you want as much normalcy as possible, you want as much time as possible, and time on the field, time in meeting rooms, time in preseason games, because there's no way you can convince me that Kevin Stefanski is a first-time head coach with no preseason games, which means he doesn't get to see coordinator Alex Van Pelt call plays, right? And last time we talked to Stefanski, he hadn't decided who was going to call plays, and part of his plan was to let Van Pelt call them during the preseason and get a comfort level with, yes, okay, you go ahead and call them, as opposed to Stefanski keeping that duty. Now he's only going to have to watch him call plays in practice, and most of that's scripted anyway, right? So that's something that Stefanski won't have. Communication, just game day communication, right? Which coaches are in the booth? Which coaches are on the field? Who calls in the plays? Not only who calls the plays, but who tells Baker Mayfield what the plays are going to be? You know, who works with the offensive line on the sideline? All those things that we see to feel like normal operation. You have to work those things out as a first-time coaching staff, and there won't be any preseason games to do that. Baker Mayfield working with Austin Hooper, his tight end. He's a brand-new guy from free agency. Yes, you'd like him to have some reps in preseason games. Rookie left tackle Jedrick Wills, he's never played left tackle before. And he's going to be your week one starter at left tackle without facing another opponent. Yes, he'll get to go against Myles Garrett in practice. But without being in a game, he's going to go week one against the Ravens. And that's something that I don't think is completely comforting for an organization or a coaching staff. So you look at all these hurdles, and then you go to the Ravens, who were 14-2 last year, had the reigning MVP in Lamar Jackson. John Harbaugh's been the head coach there forever. They won't have these same, the hiccups you would think would be so much greater for the Browns than the Ravens. So I think those are all issues the Browns are going to have to deal with. Then you talk about the roster. You cut it to, the roster's up at 55 now instead of 53. But Andrew Berry's going to have to make these decisions without having seen any of the undrafted rookies play in an NFL preseason game. It's going to be all based off practice or the college film that he already watched. So what that does is, I think all GMs show up at training camp with, these are probably going to be my 55 guys, or in the past 53 guys. But there's another, whatever it is, 5, 8, 10 guys who have a chance to make your roster. And that's before somebody comes out of nowhere and surprises you, right? Like maybe Isaiah Crowell a few years back, or Damon Sheehy-Giuseppe last year who made a run at making the roster but didn't make it. I think those guys have, those undrafted rookies have much less of a chance this year just because the opportunities to prove yourself will be so much more limited, especially in a game-type situation. So I think those are all things that the Browns have to overcome. Having said that, that's just the way the NFL is going to be. It's the way the world is in 2020, right? We all have to make adjustments. You all have to overcome. The Browns just may have to overcome more than some of their rivals, especially, the Ravens.
And taking a deeper look at this new training camp, the timeline for the camp has been really restructured a ton. One of the first things that stood out to me, Scott, was the idea that there's going to be no full contact with pads for about the first 3 weeks of camp. And some people look at that and say, you know what, maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing because the chances of these guys getting hurt and beating the crap out of each other more often significantly decreases as a result. But I also think there's something to be said for getting your body ready for full contact when the games actually mean something at the beginning of September if we follow this same guideline. So is this a good thing or a bad thing that they're going to have to wait about 3 weeks before they get into full contact with pads on?
Yeah, I would say it's a good thing for player health. I do believe J.C. Treader when he talks about the greater risk of injury. And the more time the players can have working out and training under the guidance of the strength and conditioning staff and the athletic training staff, the better off they will be when they finally do put on pads. I think it's a negative for the performance on Sundays, right? I think you're going to see a sloppier NFL brand of football. I just don't think there's any way around that because there hasn't been the off-season practice, because you haven't had the hitting. I mean, last year, and I'm pretty sure the rule is you could start having full padded practices the third or fourth day of training camp last year. And Freddie Kitchens put these guys in pads all camp. I mean, they were at camp almost as many times as they could be. And we can argue about if that's good, if that's bad. Some teams do it less. But you feel like you're more ready for the season, right? I feel like the coaches for sure feel like that's the best way to prepare my team for the NFL, the rigors of the NFL season and tackling. And you just won't have that same volume of tackling and blocking and hitting when you enter week one this year, and I think that will lead to sloppier football. And if you're talking about the Browns, week one is in Baltimore, right? September 13th. You have to tackle Lamar Jackson, and he might be the toughest guy to tackle in the league. And you're going to do it possibly when you've only had, 5, 7, 10 practices where you're allowed to tackle, and then you're going to go take on Lamar Jackson in that stable of running backs and that different offense they run. It seems like a really tall task given what we're going to see over the next 6 weeks.
Well, Scott, we'll hit on one more Browns topic before we get into some opening day memories and then the golf shot of the week to wrap things up. But recently you wrote a piece on Browns offensive lineman Chris Hubbard and his issues with mental health and how he certainly wants to reach out and help others and answer some questions from others who might be going down that exact same path.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I started working on this story, it was about a year ago. It was last year in training camp. I'd seen Chris do some interviews in the off season before 2019, talking about his battle with mental illness, and I wanted to talk to him about it. He's a key member of the team. Last year he was a starting right tackle. He's probably going to come off the bench this year, and it's just one of those things where you get in the course of a season and other stuff happens, and there's no kind of immediacy to write it. So we talked, and he talked about how he battled depression and anxiety, and he believes that he's come through on the other side, and he's got kind of a regimen he goes through, and he reads the Bible, and he reads motivational quotes, and he's got his wife talking to him, and he's seen a counselor provided by the Browns, and he feels so much better, but he wants to use his platform to encourage others to not ignore mental health. And there's still a stigma among the black community about mental health, and if you look at the statistics, black people seek help for mental health way less at a lower rate than white people do. It's about 50% rate from one of the studies I saw. And I just felt, when Chris, it was so, to me it was interesting, is when he was dealing with kind of the peak of his mental health issues, was right about when he was signing his huge contract with the Browns as a free agent. And you would think, just kind of maybe ignorantly, that, man, the guy should be on top of the world. And he was thinking about quitting football. And his wife talked him into staying, and he lost 20 pounds, and he was able to regroup, but he dealt with those things, and they were really real to him. And now he's trying to help everybody else. So I wanted to check in with him, given the current state of our country and our world, right? People are at home dealing with isolation, dealing with fear, dealing with the coronavirus, and then you add on top of it the racial injustice. And it's a really difficult time for people dealing with mental health issues. And I talked to Chris a couple of weeks ago, and his message is, it's a really difficult time, and I'm here to listen. And he said, hey, I put out my Twitter account, I put out my Instagram account. If people just want to kind of reach out, I'll listen. And he's continuing to do interviews. He's continuing to use his platform because he thinks the issue is that important, and he just wants to be there for people. And I think in this time, that message is so important.
Absolutely it is, and it's also nice to see more athletes come out and speak out on this, and all for help to those who certainly need it, because you're right, in these times, mental health is something that I think we're going to be dealing with for a while, because this pandemic has affected all of us in so many different ways. All right, Scott, we are recording this on Friday, which means opening day is tonight, depending on when you download and you listen to the podcast, and I'm just kind of curious as to what some of your favorite opening day memories are. Don't necessarily have to be Indians related, but what are some of your favorite opening day memories?
Yeah, I would say they're all pretty much Indians related. I know I lived in Chicago for a little bit at school, but I don't think I ever went to an opener at Wrigley or Comiskey. I'm sure we, stuck out of class and went to the bar to watch some of those. But, the Indians, even at like 94, right? It's interesting because that was when Jacobs Field opened, and it was a near no-hitter by Randy Johnson, and the Indians had the big comeback. Just kind of started that run of late-inning magic that they had for years. And I try to remember, I'm sure I was at school, so I don't know if I made a point to go watch the game somewhere, but I've heard so many stories about it and watched it on TV and seen all the highlights that sticks in my head, right? President Clinton threw out the first pitch. Like, it was such a huge day in Indians history that one jumps to my head. And then I've covered a bunch of openers. In fact, this will be the first home opener I haven't covered. It might be 20 years, because I just, I go and I help Chris Ossenheimer, and I help Jim Ingram, and, you're right, for page one, and you're at a column or a sidebar, whatever, because I love going to opening day. So I've seen a lot of great stuff covering games. I've also had to leave because the game's been snowed out. Right, those stick in your head when you go home. You're like, all right, are we coming back the next day? And some days you come back. Sometimes you come back the next day. Sometimes they move the series to Milwaukee, like they did that one year, because it was going to snow forever. And then the last thing that pops into my head is my family is such a huge baseball family that opening day is a holiday. I mean, one of my cousins gets 30 tickets, and they meet up and they start in Parma, and then they wind up in Tremont, and then they wind up at the game, and then they wind up back somewhere else. And it becomes this big party. And usually I catch up to them at about 10 o'clock at night after I'm done writing, and the party is pretty much wound down, but you can tell everybody had such a good time. So obviously this one will be different, right? I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of bar hopping going on. I think most people are going to watch the game from their TV, but it will be nice to have baseball back on. And besides the PGA Tour, this will be the first sporting event that I've really sat down and watched. I watched a few innings of the Dodgers game last night, flipping back and forth, but it doesn't hold my interest like the Indians games do.
100% agree with that. It's nice to watch baseball, but you're right. To me, opening day doesn't feel like until it's the Indians playing. So I'm with you on that. The Dodgers and Giants was nice last night, but it did not. I don't think it's going to register opening day until we see the Tribe play later on tonight. All right, Scott. Golf shots of the week. Where'd you get a chance to go out and play last week, and what shot stood out?
Yeah, I'm going to give you two. I didn't have the same last week. I was giddy because I played so well. I did get off to a good start. I think we talked last Friday, and then I played Pleasant Valley, and not to brag, but I started off par birdie, and then it went downhill from there. But one of those birdies on number 4 at Pleasant Valley, it's a par 3. There's a bunker in front, and I hit a 7-iron that I wasn't sure was going to get there, and it kind of hit the downslope after the bunker, and you can't see the bottom of the flagstick. So I thought I knew it was going to be on the green. Get up there, it's about 1.5 feet away. So it wasn't a perfect shot because it was a little shorter than I would have, kind of visualized. I would have flown it all the way to the hole. But it's probably as close as I've come to a hole-in-one, getting up there, and it's 1.5 feet away. So there's an easy tap in. And then I got up to Royal Crest this week, and I hadn't played there in a while, and I did not play particularly well. And I was coming off a couple of bad holes. And then on number 6, it's a long par 4. And I had to drive a little bit to the right, but I still had a second shot, but it was a long second shot. It was, 195, 200. And there's a big tree in the way. And I was able to carve a 4-wood or a rescue club around the tree, and it wound up running there on the green to about 20 feet, and I made the par. So it wasn't a great day, but that was a rescue club that I'll remember for a little while.
So you were 1.5 feet away from an ace?
That's true. Now, it was, and that's probably as close as I've ever come. I might have had other shots to within 2 or 3 feet. But yeah, it was. I got up there, and it's one of those where you have to drive up, and the guys I was playing with who were behind me, like, oh my gosh, look how close that is. So I don't know. It's interesting because I was watching the PGA Tour yesterday, and Bo Van Pelt made an ace, and he hit the shot, and I'm sure he knew it was a pretty good shot, but he bent down to pick up his tee and didn't even see the ball go in the hole, and his playing partner had to turn around and yell. I mean, there's no fans, so nobody's going nuts. His playing partner had to turn around and yell, hey, and he's like, oh my gosh, I made a hole-in-one. I think if I knew my ball was, if I could see my, I'd never look away, because you never know what's going to happen. I mean, these guys hit so many shots and so many good shots that they're just used to the ball going at the hole. But this would have been weird to not know it went in and then get up there and it be in the hole. Now, I'm not going to be I wouldn't complain, but if I were going to make my first hole-in-one, I would like to see it go in. I think that would be so exciting.
You would need to see it go in, but more importantly, you need to see somebody else see it go in so you have a witness, right? Otherwise, it doesn't really count.
No, I hear you. I was playing once down in North Carolina, and we heard this explosion, and it was because, we were actually leaving the hole and turned around, and the guy made the hole-in-one behind us, So even if his buddies didn't believe him or we were actually looking to see the ball go in the hole, and it's just so cool. I mean, when you see a guy chip in, it's cool, right? You see somebody make a long putt, it's cool. To see somebody make an ace, and I've been in one group where the guy I was in made a hole-in-one, and it's unbelievable. It's just it's just a moment that you just don't expect, right? Nobody's thinking, oh, hole-in-one, and then out of the blue, it's something you'll remember for the rest of your life.
Oh, no question about that. It's a really, really cool experience for sure. Scott, speaking of cool experiences, this was another one. Always awesome to sit down and record a BrownsZone.com zone coverage podcast with you. Next week, we'll have a lot of training camp to talk about. Hopefully some of these issues will be resolved and the Browns will be hard after it, getting ready for the season.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, Bull, and man, we're gonna hopefully, like you said, we'll have plenty of stuff to talk about for the next 5-6 months.
Absolutely, Scott. Thanks as always. We'll catch up again next week. Again, that's Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and of course at BrownsZone.com. That's going to wrap things up on today's edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. For Scott Petrak, this is Andy Barch saying thanks again for listening and have a wonderful week.